Hey everyone, this is Randall and welcome to our second painted army showcase video. The first covered my neutral Bolton units in the lead up to the release of the Bolton mini faction. This video will show the painted units in my Greyjoy army. I still have a couple more units that need to be painted, like the Reapers, Black Tide Chosen, and I should be picking up the Pillagers pretty soon. But now's a good time to show my progress on the army so far. Greyjoys were my first army in this game, and the design aesthetic of the Greyjoy models is what initially attracted me to the game. Greyjoys still have some of the coolest looking models in the game in my opinion, with their grungy Viking Raider vibe. For this video I'll present the painted units in the order in which I painted them, concluding with the heroes, NCUs, and attachments. And at the end of the video I'll briefly explain some painting techniques and color choices I used in the painting of the army, along with explaining the basing of the army. The first unit I painted was a unit of Greyjoy Ravers. With so many units in this game to paint, I've always tried to prioritize painting the units that are most likely to see play on the table. This way I'm most likely to have a mostly painted army on the table when I play games. For the color scheme of these Reavers and subsequently the rest of the army, I took direction from the Greyjoy starter box art. I really like the sea green and aquamarine color of the box art. Although it's a deviation from the black and gold colors of the lore, I think this color scheme really sets the Greyjoys apart from the other factions in the game. Starting with these Ravers and continuing on in my other Greyjoy units, I chose to weather the armor of the models. I assume that the Greyjoys spend less time polishing their armor than some of the more terrestrial houses of Westeros. Greyjoys, spending much of their time at sea and in and out of water, realize the futility of attempting to keep their armor clean and shiny. As a result of frequent dips in the waves and coastal raids, their armor develops some spots of rust and grime. Some of this rust can get knocked off easily enough, but the rest cannot without great effort, which the Greyjoy Ravers don't have the time or patience for. A couple of little details to mention from this unit. The Bannerman is carrying a Kraken sigil that I've weathered with Dirty Down Verdigris effect, suggesting that the sigil is made of bronze or brass. Also, there are 3 campaign streamers on the banner that I've colored to suggest that these Reavers have successfully raided Lannister, Stark, and Baratheon-owned villages. Moving on to the next unit, the Bowman saw extensive use in Greyjoy armies from the launch of the faction until the faction rework in Season 3. They're no longer the auto-include that they once were, but they still see a good amount of play since they are such a cheap ranged unit and they can be paired with the Euron attachment to turn them into an effective early game pillage battery. These Bowmen are painted with a uniform color of sea green, in contrast to the slight, almost indistinguishable variety of green shades in the Reavers' cloaks. Even with the same green-colored fabric, I've made an effort to distinguish all these miniatures from one another in other ways. You'll notice they all feature a variety of hair colors, quiver colors, and pants, glove, and boot colors. If you mix up some of the colors of these components on your minis, it can trick the viewer's eye into seeing the unit as a group of individuals rather than a block of clones. Although there may only be 3 or 4 different poses in a unit, if you mix up the colors of some of these small parts of the minis, it can make the unit look much more distinct. The third unit I painted was the Ironmakers. These guys were both a joy and a challenge to paint. They were a lot of fun in one regard since they're mostly covered head to toe in armor, which gave me the opportunity to weather them and make their army look all worn, rusty, and dirty. At the same time, this unit's minis all feature large flowing cloaks, which called for careful consideration about the colors to paint them. In contrast to the Reavers' subtle cloak color changes and the Bowman's complete lack of green variety, I chose to give the Ironmakers 2 shades of green cloaks and 1 shade of blue. With this added shade of blue, it would make a portion of the army look very distinct from the back. Because of how much of each mini is covered in heavy armor, which would more or less be painted the same between minis, it ended up being this cloak color that differentiated the minis the most. Some painting notes for these guys. I used Dirty Down Rust effect on the scale mail coats of some of the Ironmakers. I had to add the Dirty Down as a final step after varnishing the minis because applying varnish over the Dirty Down has a nasty habit of knocking down and diluting the rust effect. One final note, I've added a dirty muddy effect to the fringes of the Ironmakers' cloaks. This gives them a bit more of a savage on-campaign look, and like a lot of the details I paint on my minis, it makes them look more like denizens of a real lived-in world rather than just toys on a plastic tray. I like to look for ways to tie the minis to their world in subtle little ways. The fourth unit I painted, and probably my favorite set of Greyjoy sculpts, is the Greyjoy Trappers. I've always loved this unit's sculpts and their role in the battlefield. Even when Trappers were out of favor in the meta, I'd almost always bring them along in lists. I was both excited and dreading painting this unit. I was excited because I was looking forward to the challenge of differentiating these minis from one another through the various methods I've mentioned previously on other units. But that was also what I was dreading. Painting so many units with so many subtle changes made batch painting much less feasible for this unit. The biggest batch of any particular clothing or armor item would be maybe 3 or 4. Aside from the barbed spears and nets that they're carrying, which were all painted the same, these minis are all an assortment of various distinct elements. With the Trappers, you'll again see a mix of green and blue fabric shades. You'll also see a familiar mix of hair colors, with my favorites being the redheads. In any of my painted units, I always have a soft spot for the redheads and the salt and pepper old dudes. Probably my favorite painted element of this unit are their barbed spears. I weathered their spears with a dark enamel wash and some various shades of rust-colored paints. I wanted these guys' spears to look like, if they didn't kill you immediately, that you'd probably die of tetanus or an infection a few days later. My next painted unit was the Drowned Men. You'll notice only 2 Drowned Men here rather than 3 that came in the box. This is because I sold off one of my Drowned Men after I bought the box, knowing the chances were slim of me ever running 3 at a time. These guys were a fun challenge for a couple of reasons. Primarily they were a challenge because they were the least clothed unit of any unit that I had painted in the game up to that point. And painting skin always feels like one of those binary painting tasks. You either succeed or you fail. Thankfully, my skin painting has progressed to the point now, though, through repetition where I'm fairly confident of success. I attempted to integrate some of the same green and blue shades that I've used for the rest of my army to tie these guys together with the army. Aside from those colors, the rest of the colors I chose were fairly muted and grungy cloth colors and kind of seaweed colors. These Drowned Men don't strike me as the kind of guys who like to change clothes or use soap or bathe at all outside of dips in the ocean, so I wanted them to look a little grimy. I painted their driftwood clubs to look like the business ends were festooned with bits of coral and shells. We'll take a quick look at the Drowned Prophets since they came in the same box as the Drowned Men. I painted these guys in colors consistent with the rest of the army. I found the sculpts, though, to be a bit more simplistic and stylized than those of the Drowned Men. The painting on them was done pretty quickly without too much care since I wasn't sure at all at the time whether I'd be using them on the table. The final combat unit I painted so far, as of the time of recording, was the Silenc Men. While there are many Greyjoy units whose sculpts I love, the Silenc Men are not among them. These sculpts lack variety in almost every regard. They all seem like the same guy in a few different poses. Their weapons are all completely identical. The only weapon variety comes in the degree to which their axes are drooping, due to them being manufactured in soft plastic rather than the hard plastic that most units' weapons are sculpted. I couldn't be bothered to correct the drooping axes with warm water and patience, so what you see is what you get. In contrast to the other units in the army, I've not painted these guys with the same sea green and blue shades. I've given these guys their own distinct muted shades of green. When I painted Euron Greyjoy earlier on before painting this unit, I gave him a distinct dark green cloak to set him apart from the rest of the Greyjoys. I wanted Euron to look a bit different, and as a result I wanted his unit, the Silenc Men, to also look different. So these guys look like they belong to Euron. I did my best to mix up their cloak colors and armor colors to make them look a bit distinct from one another, but like I said a moment ago, their sculpts are so similar that it's really hard to set one model apart from another. I finished these guys up by applying some rust paints to their armor, to their axe, and painting some dirt and mud onto their cloaks in a similar fashion to the Ironmakers. That's all for the combat units for now. I still have the Blacktide Chosen and Harlaw Reapers to paint, and soon I'll be picking up the Stony Shore Pillagers that will enter my painting queue as well. These 3 are all very interesting units to paint in their own ways, and they all now have a pretty solid spot in Greyjoy list building, so I'm looking forward to adding them to the paint queue later in the year. Moving on now to the heroes, NCUs, and attachments. Explaining the painting of each of these would take quite some time, so I'll just show them all on the turntable and then pull out a few favorites or notable ones to talk about. Eric Ironmaker was one of the first NCUs I painted for Greyjoys. Painting his chair was quite a fun time. I didn't want to seat him on a simple wooden chair, so I took the opportunity to flex my weathering muscles once again, and I gave him a bronze chair with a verdigris effect applied to the areas that don't frequently come into contact with hands, butts, or feet. My assumption is that Eric either smelted this chair himself or he stole it from someone, and it comes in almost constant contact with salty sea air. Another notable thing about Eric is that while he's an NCU, he's also a commander, And unlike every other dual commander NCU in my collection, I did not paint his base to blend in with my movement trays. Was this an oversight, you might ask? No. It was simply a case of me being short-sighted and thinking that Eric Ironmaker would always be a garbage commander that never saw any action on the battlefield, so I didn't bother to base him. I think in the future, if I use him more on the battlefield, I might proxy a more dynamic mini as Eric. Carl was another early character that I painted. As you can see, he's about 50-50 mix of sea green fabric and armor. I thought I did a decent job of painting and highlighting the fabric, although if I was to paint him again, I'd turn up the highlights a bit more. The reason I mentioned Carl, though, is that this was an early attempt at true metallic metal shading for me. You may or may not be able to notice, but he's not simply one color of metallic paint all over. In the recesses and shaded areas, I've blended in dark grays and black to give more contrast to the armor. I've then also picked out the highlights of the armor with silver or chrome. I think this gives off a good effect from a distance. Okay, now really quickly we'll look at the paints that I use as kind of the fundamental base for my Greyjoy faction colors. The base of the green is always scale color boreal green, and I don't really ever use it straight from the bottle. I always mix it with something. So generally when I start off base coating a unit's cloaks or other armor or fabric element that's going to be green, I'll mix in a little bit of Vallejo green gray. This kind of knocks down the intensity of the boreal green, which straight out of the bottle is super super strong, and it's a very stark color right out of the bottle. So I'll mix it with the green gray, and then I'll build up highlights a little bit by adding a little bit more green gray to it. And then finally I'll add some sky gray to it for the highest of the highlights. And that's pretty much it for anything you see that is that kind of seafoam gray color or seafoam green color in my army. It comes out of boreal green and then a mixture of this green gray and sky gray. And then similarly, anything that looks blue you can see is Caspian blue from scale color as the base. Sometimes I'll mix in a little bit of boreal green to kind of tie it to the other green color in the faction. But I think the Ironmakers were straight up Caspian blue mixed with sky gray. So I think in the deepest shadows it was pure Caspian blue, and then I just slowly built it up with sky gray. If you wanted to make it a little bit more interesting though, like if I was to do this again, I'd probably add in a little bit of boreal green. I'd maybe not just highlight it with sky gray, but maybe highlight it with another color like an ice yellow or something. Highlighting things strictly with gray can kind of lead your minis to look a little bit bland and muted, and I'm all for kind of a muted color tone, as folks can probably tell, but I think you can get some more interesting highlights if you steer clear from strictly highlighting with gray or white. Now here are the Dirty Down Effects paints. I say paints in quotations because this really isn't a paint as much as it's like an effect, kind of a liquid effect. I don't know what you would call it, but it's like it's an alcohol-based. I'm pretty sure it's an alcohol-based effect paint, quote-unquote paint. As I mentioned earlier, I've always had trouble varnishing it, so now anytime I use it, I always just apply it after the varnish and try not to touch it because it is very sensitive to being reactivated. This is something I'm probably not going to be using too much in the future unless I need to use it over like a really large area or use it over some like scenery or something. I haven't used either of these bottles all that much, but I think just from the fact that I've had them for a couple of years now, and I think they kind of off-gas a little bit through the bottle or out of the space between the cap and the bottle. The bottles are practically empty at this point, and I haven't used them that much. So I think just from off-gassing and the fact that they're like an alcohol-based effects paint, quote-unquote paint, I think if you don't use them quickly, within maybe a year or so, you're gonna find yourself with an empty bottle after not too long. All right, now I want to talk about basing just for a moment. Whenever I base an army, I generally want to choose a basing style that will look natural on the table. I go back to the saying that these are game pieces, not masterpieces. It's kind of my mantra that I always try to keep in mind when I'm painting things. First and foremost, I want my painting and basing to serve the unit's role as game pieces. Therefore, as cool as I think the popular Greyjoy basing style of the beach and crashing waves looks, for me it looks too out of place on most tables, and I want my army to feel as one with the table as much as possible. Additionally, the beach and waves basing style usually requires that certain minis always be put back in certain spots to maintain the look of the basing, and that's another strike for me. I want units to be interchangeable with any spot on any base from any unit tray in that unit's army. When we're playing a game and I heal a unit up, I want to be able to just slap units back onto the tray without regard for their proper place. To this end, I've chosen a basing style that's designed to emulate rocky Scandinavian coastlines, with dark soil, green grass, and rocks jutting out here and there. This is a style that could also read as an inland battlefield, so I can tell myself that it's a coastal basing scheme and also be satisfied that it'll fit into most gaming tables. So these are the materials I use for basing. I start off with the Vallejo earth texture paste, and it doesn't really matter too much which one you use since, for me, I always paint over it anyway, so it doesn't matter too much which color you use, but I put the brown earth here. Then after that, I go in and I base coat over that earth paste once it's dried with chocolate brown. And then after that's dried, I'll just kind of dry brush the chocolate brown with a beige color to just kind of give it some highlights. And then after that, I mixed up a 50-50 mix of Woodland Scenic's medium green, which is kind of a darkish, kind of a vibrant green, like a dark vibrant green, with Army Painter Battlefield Grass mixture, which is a mixture of bright green and some yellow. So I do a 50-50 mix of that, and then I take some Woodland Scenic medium gray talus, which is like little pebbles, like little tiny rocks, and I'll mix that into the grass mixture as well. So once I base these units, and I'll sprinkle this grass and rock mixture over the glue. I use PVA glue over the bases. I'll sprinkle this on, and it'll allow the grass to get on there, and then some of the little pebbles will fall on there too, which kind of breaks up the kind of monotony of just the grass, to give it a pretty decent look in my opinion. Also, before I put the grass on, and while I'm putting the earth paste on, actually, so while the earth paste is going on, I'll stick some larger size rocks on there. That's kind of key for this basing scheme, since it's supposed to look like a kind of rocky coastline. So I'll stick some bigger rocks in there. And then once it's all done, once the grass has been put down and it's all dried, I'll go back and put in some grass tufts just to add some variety to the elevation of the grass. That's about all I have to say for this Greyjoy Army Showcase video. I hope you've enjoyed taking a look at the progress of my Greyjoy army. After I finish my remaining Greyjoy units, perhaps I'll create a short update video to this one. If you'd like to see another Army Showcase video in the future, let me know in the comments. Also, if there's anything I didn't talk about that you'd like to know more about, please leave a question in the comment section and I'll answer it for you. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider throwing it a like and subscribing to the channel. Until next time, this is Randall, signing off.